So, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners and give a little bit of background about yourself?
Uh, Gladly. My name's Michael Balaban. I presently live in Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm originally from Chicago, Illinois. I was living in Chicago, and I was eventually originally sent to CEDU, so I guess I was a Chicago kid back then. More recently, I retired as sergeant from the United States Army back in 2015 after injuries incurred in Afghanistan. Before that, I was in retail and furniture management in the family business. And then back in 1993 to 94, from November 15th, 93 to November 15th, 94, when I was 16 and 17 years old, I was a resident at the CEDU School in Roaring Springs, California.
And what is CEDU and where did it come from?
Well, I think you did a bang up job in your last interview, last episode, really getting into the origin stories of CEDU. And just to kind of reiterate what you said, CEDU stands for Charles E. Diederich University, as it's understood now. For years and years while it was in operation, it was understood as an anagram for see yourself as you are and do something about it. Or as you want to be, one or the other. It was, as has been found out more recently, a clone of Synanon 1, as we'll call it, the original Synanon from 1958 through 66, 67. You delved very well into the Mel Wasserin background, Bill Lane, and many of the other Synanon members who split off when Charles Diederich decided to make Synanon a non-graduating program.
Yeah.
And that was when they decided to basically invent their own program, same backstory, focused towards adolescents by the name of CEDU. So yeah, it was a residential program under the guise of a school that was originated by the first incarnation of Synanon and the dissatisfaction, disillusionment of original Synanon members at the evolutions that Charles Diederich put into Synanon.
Okay. And how did CEDU specifically differ from Synanon?
Well, the big differences between CEDU and Synanon were the fact that Synanon was full of volunteers. There were some Synanon members that were sent there by the courts, whether they be later on adolescents or earlier, some adults were sent there. At the same time, everyone at Synanon was pretty much there voluntarily, looking for some sort of solution to their own addictions or their own paradigms that didn't fit with their lives. In the case of Squares, CEDU was instead an institution that was formed for adolescents and children, and none of the attendees at CEDU were there voluntarily.
Okay, so how would these adolescents find themselves in a place like CEDU?
Well, there were multiple methods. I mean, it really comes down to not only what were the causes, but the people that were involved in sending kids there.
Okay.
The kids there had anything from sexual deviancy issues to drug use, legal issues, absentee parenting in many cases, that were very sold on the growth curriculum while they were off doing their own thing. The truth of it is that the main placements at CEDU came from, let's see, there are three major ways you would end up there. One would be the court system, where a judge would take an adolescent whose parents had means and require them to sign up for a program, CEDU or one like it. This was the 90s in my experience, so there were quite a few that were like it.
Okay.
The others were psychiatrists. A lot of folks that have spoken about CEDU before and that I knew were sent there by their doctors. Kids with issues such as cutting, depression, or diagnoses were sent there due to the fact that they accepted kids like that and swore that they could help them. The third major reason that kids got sent there were educational consultants. like you've touched on with Lon Woodbury, who was once an admissions director of CEDU and then became an educational consultant. Educational consultants in the 90s and 2000s here in the United States were usually primarily used for colleges and universities. When a kid was graduating high school, their parents would take them to the educational consultant, and they would have a breakdown of all the universities that dealt with their type of goals and aims. But those educational consultants also worked with high school kids and their parents to help those parents find the appropriate troubled teen institution to send their kids to. So I would say about 50% of the kids there, in my estimation, were there from educational consultants. The other half mixed between judges and psychiatrists, psychologists.
Which one of those three were you involved in? So where you found yourself at CEDU?
Well, myself, I was, I fit fully into the troubled teen paradigm. I had problems with marijuana use. Consistently, when I was a teenager, I was kicked out of a few schools, and then I got in trouble with the law. So it was originally a judge who told my parents they had to send me to an institution such as CEDU. And then with the help of an educational consultant outside of Chicago, they found CEDU itself. So a combination of two factors for me.
And what was the judge's, why did you appear in front of a judge in the first place?
Well, my story, as it's laid out in the screenplay I've written about it, is that I had quite a few instances. The truth of my situation, I got arrested at a Grateful Dead concert in the summer of 1992. I was sent to a local reform school in Chicago for about 6 months or so, or more like 3 months, from the start of the school year in 93 up until November, when I was kicked out of that school. At that point, I was in arrears of the judge's order, and my parents went to the educational consultant to find a troubled teen institution that was more rigorous, that I would be forced to complete my term.
I've actually read your screenplay, which I was really, really impressed with. It was very insightful, and some parts of it were uncomfortable to read. So if that's how I felt reading your script, I can't imagine how it must feel personally experiencing and living these experiences. But do you think that it's only the first scene, which is sort of your first day, you depicted your first day of arriving on the CEDU campus. Do you think that this experience of yours is personal to you, or do you think it's sort of unanimous to everyone that experiences CEDU?
I can only speak to the CEDU of the 90s when they were in their heyday.
Okay.
But as I research it more, I find more and more students that give testimonial that is very much in line with mine.
Okay.
So I'm starting to realize they have a specific set of methods that they used on any student's first day. Okay. That really was sort of a uniform policy. In my screenplay, I go into it, but it really goes into a process of day one. You were either brought there by the escort services, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit as we go on, or you were brought by your parent. The primary method, if you weren't brought by an escort service to school, to the property from your home, was that your parents would give you a mascaroka, as they say in Russian. The school would tell your parents, don't let your kids know that you're leaving them here. Just tell them you're coming for a tour, you're going to check the place out, and then make your decision. Don't make any commitments about your children staying long term. But once you got there, as you were touring or in processing, your parents would sign the paperwork and then be off without you. There was this component where they insisted that you be abandoned at the property. After that, you would go straight into a strip search. And then they had this policy where they would set you up so that you would break some small infraction within your first hours there. You would always in process on a Monday, Wednesday, or Friday morning, early afternoon, directly before a wrap started that afternoon. Once you went through that wrap and you were completely torn apart, you would be pushed into a slush session directly after. By the end of your first day, you didn't know up from down. and it was set up that way intentionally.
And obviously you at this time, you're 16, 17 years old. What is the youngest age for somebody to enroll in the specific program that you were in at CEDU?
Well, they had the CEDU High School, and at the time I was there, they also had a middle school.
Okay.
You touched on the different schools. It originally started with a high school format. Eventually, I believe in the late 80s, early 90s, they brought in the middle school. You would be assigned to one or the other based upon your age at entry. If you were, say, 12 through 14-ish, you would go to the middle school. If you were 14 or 15 on through 18 through 16-ish, which was the latest they would bring you in, you would go to the high school.
Right.
Students who were 16 or 17 weren't brought to CEDU because they would turn 18 during their time there. 16 was the latest going on 17, so that you'd be there a year or two before you turned 18 and more likely to stay and finish out the program.
And do you believe that this same approach with parents sort of almost abandoning their children was happening to the younger children as well, the 12-year-olds?
Absolutely.
That's absolutely heartbreaking. I can't imagine a 12-year-old. I can't imagine anybody going through that experience, that whole day in itself, especially being 12 years old. I read the memoir by Zach Bonney called Dead Insane or in Jail, and his depiction of his first day was actually his dad just driving off down the driveway and leaving him there at CEDU after he thought that he was going skiing down the mountainside. And then obviously that didn't happen. He then talks about his cavity search that he endured. So it does seem to sort of have a very tight regime that happens to new people. And we've talked a bit about Whiteout as well, which is Latha Lybrook's memoir. And she actually talks about having a cavity search herself as well. What were your first impressions of CEDU?
Well, I was a little too confused at the time. I was one of the folks that on my initial arrival, I was driven up by my father under the auspices of taking a campus tour, just to see the place and see if I wanted to go. Within my first 30 minutes, I was briefly toured around campus to get this first impression of the grandeur of it. The property, as you stated in your last episode, was the old Walter Houston mansion in Rounding Springs, or lodge. It was a large wood building, just a massive lodge with a view forever down the backside. The entire complex was beautiful. It was immaculately groomed. I didn't know at the time by students on work assignments, but it was just, it looked like a paradise in many ways. You really didn't have an idea of what you were approaching because the promotional materials were all inspirational. They spent 3/4 of it on the academic program that didn't actually exist. So parents were sold on it. You went up there talking exactly like Zach Bonney said, or Lee Lathrop said, is that you went up thinking that you were going on a tour of this beautiful place that took you skiing every winter and had these beautiful wilderness expeditions all the time. They had activities and arts and all these other wonderful things that sold not only the parents, but the students originally. It was only on your first day when you get your first impression, you start out with the grandeur of the place on your basic tour. Then while your parents were signing the paperwork, your parents would abandon you there. They'd be told to leave without saying goodbye. That was it. They weren't allowed to say goodbye to you. It was a part of the impact of arriving. So while you're touring this magnificent campus that, in all truth, you barely get to use any of the amenities while you're there, you end up abandoned. And then while you're dealing with that abandonment, you're being pulled into the admin office for your body cavity search. And you're on your own in this beautiful place about to start experiencing things that'll throw you so far off kilter, you don't know up from down.
So you've arrived at CEDU, you've had your first day. Obviously, you touched upon, the beautiful scenic mountains that you can see, the impressive building itself that parents are probably really, really impressed with. What is the rest of your CEDU experience? What is the entire structure of what is the curriculum, so to speak?
Well, there's where it's a little difficult because the curriculum differed from student to student based on a couple of factors.
Okay.
The number one factor that determined what your curriculum at CEDU was your agreement status.
Okay.
When I say agreement status, we're using CEDU lingo here. You weren't breaking rules or you didn't break rules or go with rules. You were either in agreement or out of agreement. Famously said, we don't have rules here. We have agreements. Whether you actually agree or not, they're agreements. You're either in agreement with it or out of agreement. Those agreements determined how you were treated at the school. The further out of agreement you were, the more consequences you would face, and the more your curriculum and your daily activity would change. The thing that really changed the way that the day worked was your placement within the program, what stage you were or peer group. When you started out, your daily routine was way different than when you were getting towards the end. You didn't even go to academic classes for your first 6 months there. The academics that you did were called work ethics. That was the name of the class. And you'd spend all day at the woodshed, cutting wood, chopping down trees, doing manual labor. Literally, they'd try to give you high school credits for it. As you advanced, you added more academics. You went through the different workshops and crop feeds, got more trust, were able to expand yourself, got a bit more free time. You were allowed to do more with that free time. It really depended on how far along you were and how much you were getting with the program. I think the basic way to say it is you start out, your curriculum was work assignments and raps. And then as you progress through the different workshops and profits and through the different peer groups and levels, you would add more academics, you would add more free time, you would add more responsibilities like touring parents and new kids that are coming in or touring the new kids themselves. You would be given a job as a big brother or a big sister where you would be monitoring other new students with some of your free time. There were other privileges you would get that would open up the process for you. It really did depend on a couple of factors. There is no set schedule that you can point to besides wraps every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon. Other than that, the rest of your time evolved based on those two.
So when you talk about being in or out of agreement, how would you find yourself out of agreement and what would be the repercussions of being out of agreement?
Well, the agreements were numerous. Getting into those is a story unto themselves with lingo and all sorts of things that would probably seem foreign at this point. But the major agreements were, even with smooshing and things, no sexual contracts. And by that, there wasn't just a no sex rule. If you even talked too much to a person of the opposite sex, or if you were, if you were LGBTQ, then it would be someone of your own sex. They would monitor that. You spent too much time with them. You talked to them too much. Even if someone accused you in a red of having a sexual contract with someone, like you guys were flirting, but you weren't, you were guilty of it. So that was breaking an agreement. Things like songs and music were out of agreement. It was called popping off. If you started quoting lyrics or even said the name of a band that was forbidden, you faced consequences for it. My gosh, any type of behavior that was against the rules, and basically any time the staff felt you weren't doing your work enough the way they wanted you to, they could even invent infractions.
Wow. Okay.
The entire culture was based upon always being in some form of trouble, whether it be from your fellow students, from the staff, or being incapable of following the numerous and often conflicting agreements.
Do you think that it was conflicting on purpose?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because the more out of agreement you were, the more intensive they could get with their methods, with both the attacks and the raps and the punishments and consequences. There were different levels of consequences you could face. I mean, if you had something minor, like you went and accidentally quoted a song lyric and someone accused you of it in a rap, you would face something like dishes. Dishes at the end of the day had different levels. One level, if it was a very minor infraction, you'd spend 10 minutes wiping down tables. Severe infractions, you'd be on pots and pans for about 3-4 hours. After that, you got into further punishments. The further you got from agreement, there were things like restrictions, movement restrictions. If you say, let's see, who was it there? Adam Egget in his Joe Rogan interview spoke about football. He was a huge Giants fan, I guess, and every Sunday they would put a TV in one of the rap rooms and you would get to watch football if you were in agreement. Or in punishment or restrictions, like Adam Egget said in his interview, he cheered too much for his team during a football game. They banned him from football, put him on restrictions on Sundays, so he couldn't go into the room. After that, they had consequence where it's, say, I had been with Adam and we were cheering too much together. Not only would we have been put on restriction from football, but from each other. So they had these things called bans, where if you were even further out of agreement, they would put you on bans from, say, the lower classes, the discovery peer group, the initial peer group, all the new kids in class, because they didn't want you to bring your corrupted behavior to them. So you would have to disavow their entire existence. You get on further than that, you would be on a table or a full-time, 24/7 work and writing assignments. Anyway it went, the further out of agreement you went, the worse the consequences became. If you initiated a power struggle with the system would break you. And it had escalating levels of consequences in order to do that.
And when you entered CEDU yourself, what peer group did you start in or did you enter?
Well, you start out at CEDU in Discovery.
Okay.
Some of the other programs like Rocky Mountain Academy in Idaho would name the peer groups a little differently, but the actual high school at Running Springs started with Discovery, which was about your first 6 months. Each peer group stage lasted approximately 6 months before you advanced to the next or were held back to another peer time extended. The first one was Discovery. After that was Quest, then Challenge, New Horizons, and Summit. Those 5 stages were pretty much determined your full experience there.
Right. Okay. And in your peer group, when you started in Discovery, are you with people the same age as yourself?
Oh, no. Age and grade meant nothing at CEDU High School. You were put into a peer group with people of all ages, determined by when they arrived at the school. So a 2.5-year program, you'd be in a peer group. While I was 16, going on 17 when I got there, there were kids who were 14 or 15 in my peer group. I had to attend classes with them when I eventually we were allowed to go into academics. We did every exercise there was together. You went through feats together. There were all sorts of different things that happened within that peer group that evolved as you advanced.
Right.
But there was no grades in any respect. And the academics were, let's just say, if you left California after CEDU, the entire 2.5 years that you were there was nothing. You had to repeat.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
I left CEDU after being there for 1 year, 1 single credit transferred to my
Wow. Oh my goodness.
I ended up having to do an extra year of high school because of it.
Okay, so we've covered peer groups here. You've mentioned a few times, you've spoken about raps, profits, and smushing. Just to touch upon for the listeners what those things include.
Well, smushing, as I understood it, was fairly unique to CEDU, but raps and profits are also known by the synonym name, the game and the trip. Raps were the synonym game facilitated by a couple of staff with students.
Okay.
They went on for about 4 to 5 hours every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon without fail. And the profits were the CEDU version of the trip, a 24-hour workshops that at Synanon involved a lot of LSD, sleep deprivation, food denial, stress positions, and all sorts of nasty things. They transferred over into profits, and instead of being based on acid and LSD culture, they became based on the book The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. Early CEDU program designers, of which I believe Mel Wasserman, his CEDU friends, and then one of the original CEDU program directors was also a longtime Synanon member. Medium Anonymous, I believe, did the research on that one. But they had to differentiate themselves from Synanon because Synanon was garnering itself a bad name and change them enough that they couldn't be tied back.
Hence the name change from
right.
Yeah.
And the addition of Khalil Gibran's philosophies, like they would take a chapter on the truth and make that the truth prophet. The truth shall set you free. The next prophet was the children's prophet, and another chapter of the prophet from Khalil Gibran would deal with nurturing your inner child and things of that nature, and they would base that trip or prophet around that one, and then move on. Instead of using the basic Synanon tenets and explanations for the things we did in the prophets, they shifted it to being based on Khalil Gibran's book instead of based upon Synanon methods. The way they did it was 100% Synanon.
When you say they, I guess you're referring to staff members?
Correct. CEDU as an institution, but yes, the staff.
What were the staff like there? What were their backgrounds, and how did they come to be in these positions?
Well, the directors of the program were all OG Synanon. Mel Wasserman, his original program director, and his good friend when I was there, who ran the program from the background with a non-official title, Bill Lane, the proprietor of Bill Lane and Associates. These are all OG Synanon members that have come through and started the program, designed the program, and down the line supervise and run the program. As far as the day-to-day staff, you had basically two different kinds. You had graduates of the CEDU program that came back to work there, as well as local staff that was hired locally, screened, and then put through the program.
What were the backgrounds and credentials for the staff members?
None. I do believe some had very small credentials and certifications, but there were no psychologists. There were no letters after the names. The grads like Russ Decker, one of the ones that I knew very well, who went through the RMA program and then came back to work at CEDU in Running Springs. You had others like Rudy Betts, who was a drama teacher locally before he and his wife were hired by CEDU. Interviews have been done with staff like Dennis Dockstetter in the Liam Sheff documentary, and with Randy Rudolph, Randy Rudolph, I believe, who Medium Anonymous interviewed, was also a local who just saw the advertisement and applied. One of the first things that they asked the prospective employees is what their comfort levels were with certain different aspects of the CEDU program. If they expressed interest enough and were sold on it, They were hired and then put through the program in their first couple of years with the residents.
Oh, okay. So staff participated in RAPs and Profits the same as CEDU students or residents?
I'd say residents every time. There is a bit of a an argument about that, but it would all call themselves resident. I think that's one of the big discrepancies between the two camps surrounding the institution. They want us to be called students. We know that there was no academics in the, so why would we call ourselves that? We were residents or even patients.
That definitely makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is that staff members would participate in these almost truth-telling sessions with children, essentially.
And some of their disclosures were absolutely horrific.
Can you give us some examples?
Now, there's one specifically that comes to mind, a staff member who was a former CEDU student who it was widely known and would talk frequently about lighting a homeless person on fire before he was sent to the CEDU program himself, and then later became a staff. One is about sexual disclosures that were incredibly graphic, coming from staff to students. There were, let's just say that we're talking about adults with an entire lifetime of disclosure and mistakes that were coming up with things that kids wouldn't even know that existed to do. So the disclosures were shocking, but in a way, the staff tried to use them as a way to identify with the students. When you would say you're just trying to mess with me, or you're being an ass, or we don't, your methods are out of line, they would justify, well, I was just like you. I had the same issues. I did this, and this. So why won't you take it from me? Because now I'm all better and I'm all grained and such. So in a way, they used it as a way to try and identify with us when in actuality, it just shocked and awed us to the point where I'm not about to go and try and take a swing at a guy who lit a homeless man on fire while he's screaming at me, because I know he's capable of extreme violence. And shown it.
And these are the types of adults that were allowed to work with vulnerable children.
Absolutely. You would have another staff member who would go into a rap and make extreme sexual disclosures to try and relate to a student who they were trying to drag sexual disclosures out of. And there are stories about that very same staff member when the student breaks down severely, literally spooning with that student of the opposite sex for an hour at a time to try and soothe them.
Right. And that would happen in the smushing sessions?
In the raps or in the smushing.
Okay.
If there were the one I'm referencing, there's a testimonial you can find online regarding it of a female student who had a sexual disclosure dragged out of her in a rap by the staff member using his own sexual disclosures and then spooning her, literally calling the rap off an hour early so he could lay with her and cuddle with her on the floor. Things like this were not uncommon.
During these rap sessions or truth-telling sessions, as I've read it be described on the internet as well, were you as residents permitted to attack the staff members who were also giving disclosures?
It was permissible by the rules, but you wouldn't do it.
Right, okay.
Because these staff determined you. If you tried to call out a staff for something, they would go, hey, you know what? I'm staff. I don't have to abide by the same agreements as you do. And you would run the risk of angering them to the point where you would face repercussions on a personal level from that staff member later on. So when somebody holds your life in their hands, and the difference between all day work assignments and actually going to classes and living a normal day to day, you didn't really want to attack them. So
Okay.
it was more of they guided and they threw their disclosures out and then said, hey, we're doing our work too. But nobody really confronted the staff on things. It was so-called permissible.
And during RAPs, if a staff member was trying to get a resident to disclose something that they simply didn't have to disclose, they're trying to entrap or enforce a resident almost to admit to something that they didn't do. Do you think that residents often took inspiration from the disclosures that staff were giving them?
And each other's. One of the main factors, if you talk to any survivor, including myself, when you were expected to, quote unquote, do your work in a RAP, if there wasn't a dirt list that you had, you invented it. If you didn't pop off, but you knew that the staff member wanted to focus on you for some reason, you would just make it up. Oh, yeah, I sang this song in the dorm, or I did this minor infraction just to try and outtake dishes and be done with it.
Okay.
The more severe disclosures from the past, I mean, there were two different types. There were dirt lists of things that you did while you were at the school that you had to cop out to in RAPs and face your music. And then there were the issues that oftentimes kids would invent things to try and get the heat off of them, which was never smart because it would come back again and again and again.
Right.
And you'd end up dealing with things that weren't actually true. One of the things is Synanon. There are statements from Synanon members that one of Dietrich's favorite methods in the game was lies and half-truths. That still advanced into CEDU because the pressure was there to disclose something that you could run your feelings on and do your work in the RAP. And if you didn't have it, you would face hostility and consequences for not going with the program. You would invent something minor if you could, but if not, then whatever they were trying to get you to confess to, whether true or not, you would just out with it, scream at the floor, take your attacks from the RAP, and then try to move on.
And what if you didn't scream or cry?
You weren't doing your work. It would give you a few chances to really dig into it and get into it. And if you didn't respond to the attack therapy with some primal scream therapy of your own, then they would just assume that you weren't in touch with your feelings, you were lost in your thoughts, as they would say, and that you weren't willing to do your work, and you'd start with dishes and your consequences would get more and more severe until you have the desired primal scream therapy reaction to their attack methods in a future lab.
From your experience, were some staff worse than others?
Absolutely. I'll throw a few names out there, and I got to throw this with the caveat that my experience at CEDU was a lot worse than most. I was a constant resistor. I was constantly on one varying degree of punishment or another, and certain staff made it their special project to mess with me. I have been referenced by staff in numerous interviews as one of the worst cases of consequences and abuse that was given to a student. Medium Anonymous, in his interview with Ranulph Reynolds specifically talked about me without remembering my name. You've seen the picture of the giant stump that I was forced to take out over a 2-month period.
I have seen it.
Poor kid was on it for a month. No, Randy, it was 2.
And it was huge. It was a big tree stump as well.
There were some staff like Dennis Dockstetter and Randolph Reynolds that were a little easier to talk to, ones that were from the local community and then got hired on and went through the program. They seemed to be a bit more sympathetic. Wow. There were exceptions to that rule, such as Rudy and his wife, Jill Banks, who were also local staff hired on, went through the program, but turned out to be pretty monstrous. Then you have others like Russ Decker, who was my personal nemesis. He, boy, I would love to get in front of that guy someday. Have a discussion as to why he was so, or the students who went through the program and came to work there were typically much more aggressive and prone to overarching responses to power struggle.
Do you think that that is because they are
they're insulted by the fact that you won't get with the program that
right?
they love
Okay.
so much. They were believers, believed in the method wholeheartedly as it had worked for them. And if you couldn't get with it, it was almost a personal insult.
Was there ever physical abuse as well as verbal abuse?
Absolutely. They were very careful. There are stories and testimonies out there about different staff. Myself personally, it was always minor. It was a staff member coming behind you and putting a grip on your pressure points on your neck.
Wow, okay.
It was enhanced stress positions, very much like the military in many ways. There were staff that, one in particular that I remember from Ascent, which we'll, I'm sure, touch on later, that ran physical training and had a giant staff. Every time he made a student puke during the physical training, he would carve a new notch in the staff. There was no room for more notches on his 6-foot staff. So it was almost a pet project of different staff to abuse the kids to a point where they suffered greatly, but without, they wouldn't just punch you in the face. It would do something that was almost roundabout passive-aggressive abuse. When it came down to sexual abuse, there was a bit more to it and there were more stories. Myself, I never personally experienced that, but a lot of the females that have testimony about this school speak to the predatory sexual nature of many of the male staff.
Well, even just spooning a female resident, after he's disclosed something is in itself extremely inappropriate and questionable. When you talk about staff members not having any credentials and the possibility of sexual abuse or sexual assault, I did touch upon Dr. Forgy in my previous episode, and James Lee Cromwell as well. Would you like to tell the listeners who they were and sort of a little bit of their connection with CEDU?
Well, Dr. Burnell Forgy was the resident psychiatrist for CEDU School. He lived locally in Running Springs. He had a practice up there. He was contracted by the CEDU School through the 90s to be the in-house psychiatrist.
Okay.
He had a personal assistant who he got a job as a night watch and a student driver on campus named James Lee Cromwell.
Okay.
James Lee Cromwell and Burnell Forgy were eventually arrested in 1998 for basically gang raping a minor.
A minor young boy?
Yes. How do I put this? James Lee Cromwell was a patient of Dr. Forgy. I'm sure, this is my hypothesis, Dr. Forgy, as a pedophile himself, retained a friendship with James Lee Cromwell to the point of moving him into his house for years, lived with Dr. Forgy and was his personal assistant. James Lee Cromwell had been investigated and prosecuted, unfortunately gotten off the charge on a couple of murders prior.
Of young boys?
Of young boys.
Okay.
He was suspected in a whole bunch of others. He had evaded the law, gotten together with Dr. Forgy, and then Dr. Forgy had gotten James Lee Cromwell a job on the CEDU campus. The CEDU campus, due to its closed culture, was a prime feeding ground for predators of all types. There were 2 student disappearances never to be seen again while James Lee Cromwell and Dr. Burnell Forgy were working on the CEDU campus. in 1993, John Inman, who was, I believe, 17 years old, suffered from severe seizures to the point where they had a stent put into his head, disappeared from campus without his seizure medicine. They never to be seen again. Later, the next year in 1994, when I was there, a middle schooler named Blake Pursley disappeared one day, never to be seen again. Now, they may have split, which was the official story out of the school, but they never called anyone. They never had any money. They didn't have the proper clothing. They were minors with medical issues out and about in the community. The hypothesis is, even though he never confessed to it while he was on death row before killing himself, James Lee Crummell was responsible for their disappearance.
It's my understanding that whilst he was working within CEDU, there was actually a warrant out for his arrest, so he was operating under a false name.
This is possible. I'm not certain of it. My interactions with him were blessedly minimal.
Okay. And when you say split, that means somebody who has run away?
Split was a term that actually carried over from Synanon. Chuck and the hierarchy used to call people who left Synanon splitties.
Okay.
That carried over to CEDU. If you left campus, you were said to have split. One of the things they love to say is that there are no bars or doors on the windows. You can come and go as you please. But the minute you set foot off of campus, you were either going down the backside of the mountain, which was about 4 miles of completely impassable terrain. Nobody ever really tried that. And if they did, it worked out horribly.
Okay.
Or you had to walk about 4 or 5 miles down a road to get to Running Springs and the local payphone where they usually found you, or you had to hitchhike your way all the way down the mountain to San Bernardino.
The backside of this mountain, is it plausible that perhaps this is where children were taken by Crummell?
Where they were taken, how they were taken, any details of that, he kept with him to his death. The fact is that only a very select few splitties, and Medium Anonymous did the research when he contacted the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. There were massive numbers of kids that split from the CEDU campus every month. Every month there were dozens of calls to the Sheriff's Department.
Okay.
Now, maybe 1% to 2% of people who split even attempted going down the backside. Just looking at it, it was the most imposing thing you could ever look at. Any story of anybody who's ever tried is a horror story where they ended up right back at CEDU on their own accord before making it all the way down. 9 out of 10 or more took what was called School Road into Running Springs to try and get to the payphone there. This was in a time before cell phones, 1993, 94. So getting to that payphone in Running Springs was pretty much every kid's mission, hoping that somebody would come get them or give them a place to go. 9.9 times out of 10, it didn't work out. We touched earlier on the escort service.
Yep.
It was run by Bill Lane, the ex-Synanon neophyte. He originally started an in-house escort service as well. And as Synanon in the 70s and early 80s started falling way out of fashion and getting into legal issues, my hypothesis is that Bill Lane was kind of forced out of any official association with the school based upon his close ties to Chuck and Synanon.
Right.
So instead, he formed Bill Lane and Associates and handled the transport of students. To this day, the business, I believe Bill Lane and Associates, he died in 2018. They went bankrupt this last year. But It's an industry now known as, what do they call it? Therapeutic transportation, that was literally started by CEDU and Bill Lane. He was the first in the therapeutic transportation business. And that's where your parents basically sign you over and they come to your house, grab you, take you to a program, or take you from one program to another. The movie Boot Camp from 2009 with Mila Kunis really goes into that. The opening scene of that movie is times two, actually. Both her, one of the twice they introduce you to these escorts.
So when you watch films like Boot Camp, or when you listen to certain pieces of music from CEDU that were played repeatedly, do these trigger you in any way?
Absolutely. I can't get into an elevator these days without shaking my head. Music in particular, they had certain approved songs that the staff would call snot suckers.
Okay.
Specifically designed to create an emotional situation. They were put on a repeat, played during smush times, played during profits, during different sessions where you were expected to get in touch with your feelings. These snot suckers were things like John Denver, Sue Crosby, Stills and Nash tunes, basically exactly the ones you would think of that bring a tear to most people's eyes normally. When I hear them now, instead of enjoying them, it just brings me right back. I shake my head. It's one of the reasons I listen to rap and heavy metal.
So the music was used to bring on further emotional feelings and openness to feeling all sorts of things during raps and slipping and such.
So while you're in a profit, as the staff is screaming at you that your parents don't love you, that's why you're here, that you're a horrible person to your parents. How can you imagine how much they must hate you after all the things that you've done to them? Cats in the Freaking Cradle is playing on repeat.
Oh my, that's...
So it was used to reinforce the emotional reactions and the primal scream therapy that they were attempting to drag out of you. As you're screaming at the floor, doing your work about how you're such a such a horrible person to your parents, how it's amazing that anybody could possibly love you, this and that. This music is just going on and on about, just Cat Stevens over and over, Cats in the Cradle, just playing it all the while. Everyone around you is attacking you, telling you what a horrible person you are to your parents and why they don't love you.
Hell.
Yeah, very much. So music was a tool to them, and any music that wasn't useful as a tool was banned entirely.
Okay. And just going back to talking about Dr. Forgy, CEDU employ a psychiatrist. They have him on campus. He has Cromwell with him as his assistant. What was Forgy's purpose on the campus?
Well, Dr. Forgy, in my judgment and estimation, he was a compliant psychiatrist. The more out of agreement you were and the more you rebelled against the program, the more likely you were to be sent to see Dr. Forgy.
Oh, right.
I had never taken psychotropic medications in my childhood. About a month or so into CEDU, when it was plainly obvious that I was going to fight every bit of it, they sent me to see Dr. Forgy, and Prozac was introduced to my life. So this is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is actually proven to increase suicidal ideations in adolescents, that was prescribed to me as an adolescent in a place that really made you want to kill yourself.
By an actual licensed psychiatrist.
By a pedophile psychiatrist.
And was it common at the time for residents to be given medication by Dr. Forgy?
Absolutely. He was there to, if you weren't on medication when you got there and you were struggling, you would see him and be put on medication. If you were on medication when you got there, you had to see Dr. Forgy periodically to evaluate your medication. And oftentimes you would change your prescriptions around to make you more compliant. There were other folks with medical issues like diabetics and seizures, as I said, John Inman had. They were also treated by Dr. Forgy for peripheral things as well. If you took medications, it was Dr. Forgy who was responsible for the dosage and the types that you took. There was a medication line that formed twice a day in the main hall, and if you were a patient of Dr. Forgy's, you were in it. CEDU, you mentioned in the last episode on the background of CEDU, it was in 1993-94 when Rocky Mountain Academy in Idaho started accepting students with mental disorders and diagnoses. CEDU had been doing it for quite some time because they had Dr. Forgy. That was a model that they brought to the Idaho programs in the mid-90s when they contracted a psychiatrist up there, a guy named, I believe it was Dr. David or Doug Ulrich.
We're starting to get an idea here of CEDU being a perfect environment for all types of predators, whether it's pedophiles or those looking for positions of power. It's just like a closed circuit.
When James Lee Crummell abducted 2 children, as is widely believed right now, the official story was that they ran away. The case was given to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department and to Bill Lane and Associates, where he had his investigators try to track them down. But this story was automatically put out that they split. It had nothing to do with the school, and therefore there were no questions asked.
And that was that.
The culture of everything was designed so that predators could successfully operate within the walls of the school. If they didn't even have to cover their own tracks, the school would cover their tracks for them.
Were there any other suspicious deaths or disappearances?
A lot of suicides went on. I know that when I first got to CEDU, rumors spread and word came through about a suicide at RMA, Rocky Mountain Academy in Idaho. That turned out to be a student named, or a resident named John Avila, who hung himself. That was a true suicide. While I was there, I cannot for the life of me remember her name, but late 93, there was a girl who slit her wrists in the girls' dorms attached to the main building. Whether or not she survived, we never knew. There was somebody who attempted suicide. We didn't know if they succeeded or not. They just disappeared. And we were told that A, they were pulled, B, they were sent to another school, or C, that they split.
That's so sad.
Whether or not people, there were attempts all the time, but they were covered up to the other students. So no matter what happened, unless you actually walked in on it, you were given some story that explained it away.
It sounds so much like Synanon in terms of the actual policing itself. There seems to be no laws that CEDU was working within, or anybody carrying out any type of inspection or any background checks on staff.
Well, if you look at Medium Anonymous's reports, what has happened, he did a lot of deep digging on the legal issues that CEDU faced. Not so much the lawsuits that eventually shut it down in the 2000s, but more the constant complaints that were brought to CEDU by Children and Family Services in San Bernardino. Mm-hmm. They happened over and over and over again, but CEDU had this way where even the authorities, when a report was made, would leave it to CEDU to self-police itself. If they got a report that a student was being sleep deprived, say in a workshop, they would come in, they would evaluate it, and they would get a whole story from the staff. Oh, that's not true. This didn't happen. And then they would say, well, you know what? You guys need to make a policy where you lay it out that it's not okay for that to happen. And then CEDU would be like, okay, we'll rewrite the policy, make sure everybody knows you can't give anybody sleep deprivation. And if it even appears that they have it, you've got to force you asleep. And Children and Family Services would be like, okay, sounds good to us. And then CEDU would just throw it away.
Is exactly what happens when you arrive at CEDU and there's a list of policies and procedures that CEDU promise they will work within, that you sign your name at the bottom of, and it's almost like it's like a little inside joke almost between staff, that they're getting you to sign a document that is almost the opposite of everything that they are going to put the students or residents through. So you've briefly mentioned Ascent and Idaho with their Rocky Mountain Academy. What are other programs that CEDU were running, and how are they similar or different to your experience?
Throughout the entire life of CEDU, there were multiple programs in Idaho that they expanded to. They were scattered between, all in the panhandle of northern Idaho, between Sandpoint and Bonners Ferry to the north. There were schools such as Rocky Mountain Academy, which I believe was the first. That was a CEDU clone up in that area. Okay. That one is the one that you can say was pretty much a carbon copy of CEDU through the years. They also opened a school called Boulder Creek Academy, or BCA for short, and another one called Northwest Academy, or NWA for short. They had the wilderness program, their wilderness boot camp, very much like the movie Boot Camp, Philippians referenced earlier. That was called Ascent, and that was up with Northwest Academy on Ruby Ridge, about a mile or so from the Weaver household. Throughout the years, they evolved. Northwest Academy, when it was first built, I believe in late 93, was supposed to be a last stop. It was sort of like an extended Ascent program, whereas Boulder Creek Academy was more of a CEDU light. As time went on, there was a riot at Northwest Academy that that resulted in lawsuits. And next thing you know, Northwest Academy became more of a transitional living. Students were approaching 18 and they lightened up the program tremendously. And they kind of evolved and shifted as time went on. I do believe there were one or two other Idaho programs, one maybe an early transition program, but I'm not certain of that. Going back to the power struggles, Ascent, the wilderness boot camp, was used as a consequence. If you were put on a full-time at CEDU or at RMA or any of the other CEDU schools, and you were at the peak of consequence and it still wasn't working, say they put you on a stump, and if you had 2 months to get off that stump and you were still flipping the bird to the staff every time they came around, next thing you know, Bill Lane and his goons would show up. You would be escorted to Ascent for their wilderness boot camp program. And then from there, it was used as a consequence. It was escalating consequence or severity of restriction. They always won the power struggles. If at Ascent you still couldn't get with the program, the end all was up in northern Idaho. That came about when they hired Dr. Ulrich as the Northern Idaho program psychiatrist. He was also the clinical director of Northern Idaho Behavioral Health. In 93 was a psych ward for adolescents where you would stay temporarily. It was a great thing for parents too, because when you left Ascent or a CEDU school and you ended up at Northern Idaho Behavioral Health, you stopped paying CEDU the exorbitant tuitions, and all of a sudden your kid's insurance would be paying for it. So it was kind of a break for parents too. They didn't mind. Go ahead, send the kid there. Over time, Northern Idaho Behavioral Health turned into a more long-term program. The ultimate threat, like if you don't get an agreement, we'll send you to Ascent. You get sent to Ascent. If you still can't get an agreement, you'll go to NIBH. And NIBH was originally temporary, but then they actually formed a school out of it, basically a psych ward school, and you would stay as long as you needed to. Some testimonial about kids who just wouldn't get with the program, they spent a year or more in NIBH. So there were other schools that were used as a threat as well, such as Provo Canyon School in Utah.
Yes, I've read about that one.
Or also a lockup. and a TTF, they always had further consequences. If you wanted the power struggle with CEDU, you were going to lose every time. And they had a new place that was an even fresher level of hell. It was like dealing with Dante. You want the first or the seventh level?
You could arrive at CEDU never having any prescribed medication in your life and end up being sent to a place like Northern Idaho Behavioral Health.
Yeah.
That's absolutely terrifying.
How much resistance you had.
I watched a documentary called The Pharmacist the other day on Netflix, and they were talking all about the pill mills and how actually people were being sent to have these prescriptions of OxyContin filled in, and it was seen as compassionate if you were a doctor that would prescribe this pain medication to somebody, even though actually it was not beneficial at all. And it almost feels like children being put on these medications, sent to these behavioral health units, educational consultants sending children to CEDU, it almost feels similar in the way that children are being extorted so that these industries can benefit off of the backs of the abuse of children. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. When CEDU first started, it was completely modeled after Sydenham. The early CEDU out of Mel Wasserman's living room and when Running Springs first started was all not-for-profit. When Bill Lane came to officially work for CEDU in 1974 during the transition from phase 2 to phase 3 of Sydenham, that was the religious inspiration that Chuck Dietrich had. He actually came on while it was still a not-for-profit and ran the fundraising and the resource sourcing that the nonprofit, like they completely individuated and distanced from Sydenham. Bill Lane started Bill Lane and Associates and stopped officially working for CEDU because of his Sydenham background. And things kind of evolved from there into a for-profit model that demanded that closed secrecy. It threatened profits and investors.
Through all of this, through all of your time at CEDU, did you ever feel like you'd ever become fully compliant? Were you ever 100% in agreement?
Myself, no. And that's one of the reasons that I had such a rough go of it. I couldn't get with the program from the beginning. From day one, I realized there was something incredibly wrong about this place. I didn't know what Synanon was, but I knew from my first rap that nobody's supposed to treat you this way in life. This is wrong. And that I'm not going to go with it. There was an element of it where you had to sacrifice any type of meaningful friendship because you were constantly required to report on your fellow students and their breaking of agreements. If you didn't, you were in trouble yourself. So everyone around you was a rat. No matter what you did, somebody was going to bring you into a rap and lambaste you and tear you apart in it. Doesn't matter what you did. It was students, staff, everybody. The entire culture was so objectionable to me in the way that I was brought up, I just couldn't go with it. Besides that, I was favorite of Russ Decker. Russ Decker and I were in a 24/7 power struggle where his methods towards me, he didn't want me to go with the program. He wanted me as his punching bag.
Okay.
So even if I tried to get with it, the guy in charge of me, Russ Decker, wouldn't have it. Oh, and as you mentioned about that documentary, The Pharmacist, I've been through that ringer too. After my injuries in Afghanistan, the VA was very big on prescribing heavy doses of opiates to me. And I was combined with some other things. It was to the point where they were prescribing me amphetamines so that I could survive the side effects of the high doses of opiates. So I've been through that ringer too. And yes, there was a bit of a reminiscence towards being at CEDU and going through that with the VA. These days I have other methods, pain and things of that nature, but It is very much so. Say it's for compassionate use, but really it's not. There's some very powerful folks who are profiting from these types of institutions and have from the beginning. We're talking about billions of dollars over the years. And that still profit today. They evolve, they change ownership, but the program components stay the same.
Just sometimes the inside lingo changes slightly.
For example, right now, Universal Behavioral Health is the company that owns and operates the three remaining Northern Idaho CEDU programs. I haven't seen their curriculum, but as I understand from testimony of people who have been to the United Behavioral Health versions of the CEDU schools, they brought a lot of it with them. So a lot of the Synanon curriculum still exists to this day.
Despite CEDU going bankrupt and being bought by the Brown schools, and then the Brown schools declaring bankruptcy and officially closing the doors of CEDU, actually, it's still in operation.
Absolutely. Just another company came in.
Do you feel like the programs are successful? Do you feel you were rehabilitated in any way? Did you manage to grow emotionally?
Personally, no. Personally, I didn't have the chance. I was only there for a year. I didn't finish out the whole 2.5 years. I never got out of discovery in my entire year there. And by the end of it, I would have stayed for about 4 years, even if I had decided I was going to get a degree. I would have been 19 or 20 by the time I graduated.
Decker just didn't want to see you go?
No, not at all. I was too useful as a punching bag.
I wonder what he'd say if he spoke to you today. I wonder if he's still alive.
He works in the global security department for Walt Disney Corporation, according to his LinkedIn.
Still surrounding himself with children, just a little bit from the outside, from the periphery.
Now he works for House and Mouse.
Other than CEDU and Descent, were there any other emotional growth programs that you attended or were part of?
Well, after my year at CEDU, I was pulled. I was one of the very lucky ones. Ordinarily, resistance like I had would put me into Provo Canyon or Northwest Academy at the time. But my parents had financial issues. They had set a 1 year, the same as the judge. And after 1 year to the day, my parents decided A, it was too expensive. B, the judge's required time was over. And C, I was making zero progress. The school even admitted that. CEDU admitted that. So they took me out and put me into a more refined crossed with prep school out in Connecticut. That one had a bit less of a behavioral modification curriculum, a bit more of an academic one. In the end, I would have had to go to high school for an extra year. So at 18, I dropped out, got myself a GED and went to a transitional program in Bend, Oregon. I cannot remember the name of it, unfortunately, for the life of me. Okay. I was there for 2 months. And then my parents got tired of the whole industry and it was over. I turned 18 and went home, started working in the family business for a little while. Down the road, I had made a contact and somehow I had stayed friends. I don't know if I would say friends, but I had retained contact with the admissions director of CEDU, Saul Rudman. And Saul Rudman had seen me struggling post-CEDU, ended up giving me a job at a school that he ran down in Mexico called Positive Impact. That one I worked at for about 3 to 4 months. It was very much like CEDU. And due to personal reasons, after about 3-4 months, I left there. There's a consultant for Saul Rudman again with his venture Coronado Academy of Costa Rica. which was more of a transitional living program. In the later days of CEDU, you started noticing that the programs that were spouting up were opening overseas as opposed to in the United States. Lead growing regulation and to, as they put it, bring kids further out of their element.
It's my understanding that Bill Lane was actually operating worldwide at one point as well.
Absolutely. Bill Lane and Associates was the first and the largest of the therapeutic transport companies.
So it always goes back to Synanon. It always goes back to Synanon and CEDU and that initial...
Yes. Dates that it was formed. I mean, there are some early innovators of schools like the Elan School, which you touched on a bit, and Straight Inc. And the list goes on and on and on. There are a few Venn diagrams you can look at online that show the evolution, but CEDU was the original back in 1967 that was literally formed by Synanon members with a pure Synanon format.
Mm-hmm.
That format changed over time, and over time, more and more schools opened up, inspired by CEDU and Synanon with different variations of the curriculum, but always in some way tying back to attack therapy, attachment therapy, or primal scream therapy, all done by untrained and uncertified ex-member staff.
And always with unwilling adolescents as participants.
The big difference between a CEDU resident and a Synanon member was the fact that we were sent there. Our parents were conned the same as we were. Our parents knew what Synanon was, but they had no idea that it was affiliated with CEDU. When the tie came out and I talked to my folks and I said, "Did you know?" They said, "You're kidding me." They were shocked. They knew what Synanon was, but they had no idea that it was Synanon methodology and program brought to unwilling adolescents.
I'd made a note here to actually ask you if you did sit down with your parents after CEDU and talk through everything with them.
They are just as much the victim as I am. Mm-hmm. If you listen to the Lost Kids podcast and listen to Daniel Ewan, a CEDU student from 2004, 1 year before the schools were closed down, he ran away from the school, never to be seen out again. His parents give a very heartfelt interview, and it's hard for me as a survivor not to relate to them. My parents are the same way. They were at the end of their rope, the same as my parents were. They felt in a catch-22. They had to send me to a program according to the judge. They felt I needed the help. And they were sold a false bill of goods, the same as we were. As clueless as I was about what the place was the day I got there, my parents were even more so. And we weren't allowed to communicate to them what was actually going on in any way, shape, or form.
So when you say you're not allowed to communicate with them, what do you mean by that specifically?
Well, we were given a phone call home for 15 minutes every 2 weeks. That phone call was in an administration office with either a CEDU employee or a senior student or resident in attendance. If at any point you started saying, "Mom, Dad, you got to get me out of here," you started describing what people said to you in raps, the attacks you were getting, things of that nature. If you started crying, "I can't take it." If you tried to say, "This staff member did this," they would literally hang up on you and then kick you out of the room, call your parents back, start reciting all sorts of things that you had said in raps that they didn't know about to demonstrate exactly why you needed to be there and why you were going through such a hard time and asking to be sent home.
And some of this stuff that you disclosed in raps was completely false in the first place.
2 things I had to tell my parents after the fact. No. I just told them that so they would leave me that alone.
It's not surprising that when parents are being told by a judge a professional of the legal system that this is what is best for their child and this is what needs to happen.
It wasn't just the judge. At that point in the early 90s, the words of Nancy Reagan and her favorite program, Straight Ink, were ringing in the heads of every judge, educational consultant, news media outlet, parents, everyone. No one had any clue that CEDU was Synanon, and instead it was lauded and heralded as the only way to get your kids straightened out. So all the powers that be were 100% behind it.
Did mention previously that there were writing assignments that you might be given if you were out of agreement.
We'll go into the full times. One of the severest punishments you could get at CEDU was called full time in their vernacular. It basically meant full-time punishment. You woke up in the morning, you were on bans, meaning you could not speak to or acknowledge the existence of anyone in the school except a specific staff member and one specific student. You would do your morning routine, your morning chores, come down to breakfast where you would sit alone at a table in the dining room and do writing assignments in a journal. They would hand you a notebook, like a scholastic notebook, and at the top of each page, they would add another question. Like one page would be, why do I feel the need to lie to my parents? The next page is, why do I treat my parents the way I do? The next page was, how do I feel my parents, how do I think my parents feel when I do this? The next page was, how does it influence other students or when I do this? And they would give you 20 pages. And you would have to write the entire page as an answer. Single space, no redundancies, this, that. If you did, you do it over. They would have no end to the questions they would give you. They would last the entire time you were on the full time. When you finished breakfast and an hour or so of writing assignments, it was straight out to your stump or whatever work assignment they had you on. You would break for an hour lunch, in which case you would sit alone at your table again, do more writing assignments while you eat. And then after lunch, right back to your work assignment, digging out your stump or building a garden or hauling manure up a hill from the middle school to the high school that felt some field that was all dirt in the first place. And then when you were done, hey, shovel that manure back in a wheelbarrow, bring it back down to the middle school. We're talking work assignments for the sake of work. Once those were done in the evening, you would come back for dinner where you would sit alone, eat your meal, do more writing assignments, and then you'd spend 2 or 3 hours doing pots and pans on dishes until it was time to go back to the dorm and go to bed. And that was your day, all day, every day. You are the first one they get to in raps. And they usually spend about half of the rap on you. Everything you wrote in your journal and your writing assignments used against you in raps, in profits, and with your parents, anything you disclosed in your dirt lists, in your raps, you couldn't take it out and tell your parents yourself, but they could tell your parents behind your back.
They'd use your writing assignments as well as disclosures made in raps?
Anything that came out of you was subject to be used against you with your parents or by staff in raps.
I do actually think that the work assignments that they give CEDU residents, they also seem to echo the jobs that the dope fiends had in Synanon, which were the chores and jobs that they would do instead of paying a fee to be a part of Synanon. So even that seems to echo the cult itself.
Well, let's put it this way. The entire time CEDU was in operation, they never had landscapers. There's no need for it. They never had to clean or hire anybody to do that. They had no need for it. It was top to bottom every Saturday. And what wasn't gotten then was gotten by the people who were being disciplined.
I think it was in Medium Anonymous's article, actually, where he said that it was always ready, always picture perfect and ready for people to come and have a look, almost like it's just a brochure ready for parents and potential new clients or residents to come and have their tour.
Absolutely.
Do you ever follow or keep in touch with any of the other CEDU survivors?
Unfortunately not. I know that the last one was this last May. I don't know whether it got off or not because of COVID, but there are those, particularly those who actually finished the program, got all the way through it, who swear by it, who say that it saved their lives. There will always be those, and there's those from Synanon as well.
Mm-hmm.
They are much more likely to keep touch with each other. Those of us who were traumatized by our experiences.
Are they this similar types of people that would end up potentially being staff members at CEDU?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How much of an influence do you think CEDU had overall on the troubled teen industry?
Oh, wow. In my research and the history I've dug up, it is the original. The original. Before CEDU, there was only Synanon.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck Dieterich's attack therapy method was almost invented by him,
Mm-hmm.
at least popularized in mainstream. It was only pre-1966-67, the only place you could really go to find it was Synanon. So CEDU starting up was kind of the original. At the same time CEDU started up, a year or two or 3 or 4 after, others started sprouting up as well. But as far as I found in my research, the only one that stayed 100% true to Synanon was CEDU. From the get-go, it evolved the same way that Synanon did.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the non-graduating and the Imperial Marines and the let's make this religion and Chuck's now God, it was more of when Synanon went non-smoking, CEDU went non-smoking. When Synanon was out there selling raffle tickets, CEDU was out there selling raffle tickets. It was, as Synanon evolved early, CEDU very much kept up under Mel Wasserman. It wasn't until Synanon completely blew up in the mid to late 70s when Chuck, screwed everything up with those Imperial Marines that CEDU 100% individuated from it, to the point of taking Bill Lane's in-house escort service and making him incorporate as his own business that was contracted on, because Bill was way too involved in Synanon to officially be a part of CEDU.
You definitely had the anti-cult hysteria of the late 70s as well, after everything that happened in Jonestown. And I feel like because CEDU was policing itself and didn't have a leader, so to speak, that called himself the Messiah and the next coming of God and all type.
He didn't call himself that, but the staff called him that. Mel was Chuck. They looked at him like he was the Messiah. His word was golden. His method was the only way to save these kids.
It also seems to be the way that a lot of media outlets would approach CEDU as well, the way a lot of newspapers and magazines would speak about CEDU. I think that's what Medium Anonymous struggled with a lot in trying to dig deeper into why CEDU managed to get away with everything that it did. And that's because it was always seen in such a positive light. It was always praised for the work that it was doing with troubled teens. And then, you had things like Friends of CEDU, which started up, which, was a service to help parents who couldn't afford to send their kids to CEDU to be able to actually afford to send their kids to CEDU. Yeah. And they would talk about how it saved their family, which is, from what you're saying, just confirmation bias, because it didn't work for you.
That's the thing. I mean, some kids it would. I mean, just like anything, there are some folks in this world who are more predisposed to letting others guide them and make their decisions, who are more predisposed to belief than fact and experience. And I think if you are that type, CEDU may have actually worked for you, but that doesn't excuse the unconscionable nature of its methods.
Mhm.
And it also doesn't excuse the damage it did to the other half of the people that went there. And it doesn't excuse the closed culture that allowed predators to proliferate.
Mhm. Thinking about how abuse victims, people that are abused when they are younger, often go on to become abusers in later life. So it's almost worrying what other products CEDU may have created, or problems that CEDU may cause today.
I got restrained quite a few times at CEDU. When I, years later, went down to Mexico to work at Positive Impact and had to perform my own first restraint on a student, that's pretty much why I only lasted a couple of months down there.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all. That must be, it's like PTSD.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I have been diagnosed with it, a complex PTSD form that takes into account the predispositions to the reactions I had to Afghanistan.
Okay.
Inspired by CEDU.
Right.
You got to understand, CEDU did great things for you in the military, and it did horrible things for me in the military.
I was actually going to ask if you were able to fall in line almost as part of the military.
Well, boot camp was nothing. I had been through it before when I was 16. Drill sergeants had nothing on First Lieutenant Sean O'Connor, who was in charge of PT at Ascent, the gentleman with the staff.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
His PT when I was 16, 17 years old was nothing compared to the Rangers in my battalion in the Army in basic. So, I thrived there. But then when I got to my unit, confrontation, especially, the chain of command was, if it was kind of like that 13-year-old kid who just came from the middle school to the high school is now 2 peer groups ahead of you while you're 17 years old and now gets to scream at you incessantly without you being able to do a darn thing about it. That translated into the military. I'd get a horrible senior NCO yelling at me, Sergeant Balaban, you got to do this, this, this. And I would just, the way that they came at me created conflict as almost an unconscious reaction planted by CEDU. The PTSD I experience to this day is a combination of affectation of my traumatic brain injury, the experiences in Afghanistan, and CEDU all put together. When I talk to a therapist these days, there's no distinguishing present behaviors and their causes and saying this happened because of CEDU and this happened because of Afghanistan.
Right.
Because the experiences were so similar that the reactions and the behaviors I exhibit now can't be attributed to one or the other.
Do you think that people who have also experienced CEDU similarly to you will have those same feelings in their own walks of life?
Absolutely. Similar reactions will cause similar behaviors in the future. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm sure there's one out there who's much more qualified to testify to that. But for me, what I've carried on with me after CEDU is, like I said, inability to deal with conflict.
Are you familiar with the CEDU documentary by Liam Sheff?
Yes.
It's the only CEDU documentary I'm aware of that actually exists.
Mm-hmm. As of now, yes.
And it explores different people's journeys at CEDU and goes into the types of things that residents were subjected to.
I've seen it many times. heartbroken by Liam's suicide. I think he had done a great deal of work. I think he had a great deal more work to do. His loss was a huge blow to all of us survivors that are trying to get the story out. And I think he did a wonderful job with it. It's very heavily viewed, and everything I've seen of it, and I've seen each segment many times, is very much on point.
And so I will post a link in the show notes for anybody that would be interested in watching that documentary. Liam did unfortunately take his own life, but from what I read in Medium Anonymous's article, it was as a result of chronic pain after some extensive dental work. But we'll never know if some of that, if some of the reasoning behind his decision had any link to CEDU. I'm sure
are always there, whispering in our ears. That's just human nature, and unfortunately, whatever the cause, it's a great blow, a great loss to us all.
It seems that Liam's one of the only major sources I could find trying to blow the whistle on CEDU and blow everything open. Of course, there's yourself with the screenplay you've written. Lathrop, we mentioned, she's got a memoir she's writing. Part of it is available on her website, Whiteout, which I did include in last week's show notes. There's Zach Bonney's memoir we've spoken about. There's Medium Anonymous's article. Why do you think it's taken 40 years almost for these stories to be told and documentaries like Liam's to come to light and blow the door open on CEDU?
Well, the first thing is the fact that it wasn't really until Bill Lane did an interview with Lon Woodbury back in, I believe it was the early 2010s. He did an interview about the CEDU and Synanon connection. And that was the first time that many, many people put two and two together for the first time. I think the revelation, I had never heard of Synanon until I heard that interview. That started me on a process of research about what it was that I had gone through. Those of us that went through it, that are damaged by it, which the number is many, are still processing our own after effects and not really concerned with revisiting it on a grand scale. It's that, as well as the powers that are behind it, the sheer amount of money that was put into the system, the powerful people behind it all. Like I mentioned before, Nancy Reagan and her favorite Straight A, which was a derivative program, to Mitt Romney and Bain Capital, who are heavily invested in the troubled teen industry today. In fact, both of Mitt Romney's past campaign managers have been board members on troubled teen institutions, school boards. So the people that are profiting from this industry are profiting greatly, and they are powerful. They spin a completely different narrative, the same one that was presented by CEDU itself and Synanon before Chuck got his, hands on screwing that all. So you've got the Friends of CEDU Foundation, which, as I understand, has changed their name within the past few years. But as far as I know, last time I looked it up, they still had $500,000 in assets. So you go on beyond that to the other graduates who have been through the program and say, well, it saved my life. I wouldn't be who I am.
Yeah.
And then you go to even other survivors like myself who don't want to hurt their parents. There's a lot of guilt involved when you go through something like this, and not just for yourself, but for your family that was also conned in many ways. So survivors that are willing to step forward and try to set the narrative and blow this whistle are swimming upstream harder than any salmon ever did.
Yeah.
And there's no, at this point, great unity amongst survivors. There's no large base or foundation of people that want to stand up and say something. Those that do have to sensationalize it ridiculously, i.e., Adam Eggett's interview on Joe Rogan. If you look at it, the title is that I spent 2.5 years in a cult when I was a teenager. We're not cultists. We are unwilling adolescents and children that were sent to an institution designed by and started by cult members using Synanon's cult methods applied to non-willing participants. There was no, willing nature to the whole thing. And that in and of itself creates for an atmosphere that you're kind of screaming into the void. Even after the big budget, I believe it was $15 million they put into the boot camp movie back in 2009. It only made 1.1 million at the box office. And nobody, even though it opened with a disclaimer about how these unmonitored and unregulated troubled teen institutions and boot camps are still proliferated throughout the country and the world, nobody cared. They were entertained and they said, oh, okay, cool. But now that Synanon connection has been made within the last 5 to 10 years, we can really see the origins of CEDU, the CEDU schools and programs, and the troubled teen industry as a whole for what it actually was. And that is allowing us to have a foundation to say, this is how Synanon became applied to unwilling kids. Instead of trying to come out there and describe our daily lives and our experiences, we can point to something that people are familiar with. I fully expect that the database of information and exposure about not only CEDU, the CEDU programs, and the troubled teen industry as a whole to grow, but I wholly expect and hope that it grows by leaps and bounds, and that certain things like this podcast in itself can open people's eyes and get that curiosity for those materials to the forefront. The more people that see what's already out there, the more people will ask questions about how it was allowed to go on for so long and why it still is. And then we can affect more change.
Yep. Especially, as we've mentioned, it is something that still exists today, and children are still being sent to these places. So even if, a handful of parents happen to listen to these types of conversations and maybe second guess a judge's decision or a psychiatrist's advice to send their children to these types of places, we can only hope that these platforms can offer that insight to people who otherwise wouldn't know. I mean, like Medium Anonymous said, the allegations of abuse were going all the way back to the 60s. It's now 2020, and still people are saying CEDU, Synanon, how are they linked? Or what is CEDU? Or what is the troubled teen industry? And what do you mean kids are being abused every day?
Well, I'm hoping that, again, podcasts like yours and other outlets will be able to put out there how we were unwilling victims of Synanon.
Absolutely.
Generations, thousands of kids, billions of dollars. But the primary point that I hope is taken away is, this was cult methods being applied to unwilling children, and there's no shame in it. Our parents and us were all conned by Synanon devotees. The entire system, judges, politicians, everyone was conned by Synanon devotees. And there is no shame towards yourself or your family for speaking out after being conned by these folks about how much it's affected your life. And you know what? If it saved your life, then good on you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to try to take that away from you. But at the same time, I'm not going to excuse it or allow anyone else to excuse it based upon that confirmation bias.
Other testimonies of people who unfortunately did not have that experience of being saved or growing emotionally or...
I did way more drugs in my 20s after CEDU than I did before I got sent there.
Which is another thing I mentioned, because at the end of Synanon, after everything that Chuck did, after everything he preached and the years of abuse that he inflicted on other people, he was found in a drunken stupor, and the whole story started with him being a drunk in AA. So if that doesn't tell us anything about Synanon and CEDU, then I don't think anything.
And I'll add the same thing about CEDU. When you look up staff and ex-staff, if you can find them online, I won't name, well, you know what, I will. Look up Rudy Bentz. He's got himself a Facebook Messenger profile, but it's him standing in the woods with his AR-15 shouldered to the sky and a come get me look on his face. Innocent people don't post pictures like that. That in itself is another confession of, we know we abused kids.
Yeah.
So it goes on.
I just wanted to end on going over a little bit more of the bite model that I tend to look at with my podcast episodes, which is Stephen Hassan's cult behavior model. We've been speaking for weeks and weeks. We've exchanged very long chain of emails where you've given me your experiences under the bite model. The first question I had leading into exploring this is, if the residents were unwilling participants of CEDU as a cult, were the staff themselves indoctrinated willingly into CEDU as a cult?
Yes, absolutely. The staff knew when they were hired that at some point they would be expected to go through the program, and they were happy to do so. Mm-hmm. Most of that staff, when contacted, felt that they were benefiting from it themselves and had belief in the method. Whether or not they knew that it was the Synanon method, they still agreed with it and believed in it, or they wouldn't be working there. You mentioned Medium Anonymous and the concerned group of employees and later in the 2000s that tried to speak out and were promptly dismissed. Uh-huh. So if you didn't go through the program as a staff member and buy into it 100%, you didn't work there very long.
There was clothing regulation. There was forced diets. There was withheld meals. We'll go into some of those in a second, but all of these restrictions and all of these things that were enforced on the residents, were they also used by the staff?
The staff would go along with it for the most part.
Okay.
Whether or not it's because they believed in it, I don't believe that the school was trying to prevent them from having an image of themselves. Mm-hmm. I think it was more of they had to display the uniform while they were there. In their private lives, I'm sure they wore whatever the heck they wanted. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that clothing, nothing with logos, nothing with too bright of colors, nothing black.
Okay.
That's more of a noir image that kids would have in the 90s. It wasn't quite goth years yet, but the same thing applied. So it all had to be pastel colors, jeans, no athletic logos, pop culture references of any kind. Very plain. Plaids were okay as long as they weren't too bright or included too many blacks.
Okay.
Things of that nature. It was all wilderness and sterile clothing. If you brought anything that was out of agreement, it was taken from you during in-processing. Updated shopping list was sent to your parents to have sent to you.
And what would happen to the items that were confiscated? Did you ever get those back?
No. Either mailed home to your parents or taken with them when they left campus or something like that.
So if you ever, because I know a lot of people have their bags searched immediately when you arrive on your dorm. So if you were to have brought with you, some items of value, they usually would make their way back to your parents.
Absolutely.
Okay. And you mentioned that meals were portioned, and those that were considered overweight were put on diets.
Yes, there were certain things, like if you started gaining weight, they would start by saying, okay, you can't have any milk with your meals. You got to stick to water. Or they'd say, don't take as much food. And then it was more of, instead of restricting your food intake directly, if you started gaining, you would be put into a rap about your lack of self-control. And you'd be torn apart about it until you wanted to diet. The actual food deprivation was more in profits, situations where food was a part of your history, like people who were emotional binge eaters before they got there would be used as a therapeutic tool against you. You faced more sleep deprivation, particularly in the profits and things like that in workshops. Stress positions were a big thing. You go into those profits, some of the stress positions they put you in would make a drill sergeant blush. There were other psychological abuses that I think were even worse, where a kid might not be food deprived, but they will be made to not be angry for days or weeks.
Right. Wow. Okay.
Where they would be hurt so much emotionally by filling their plate in the defect that, of course, they're going to go food starve.
Say, for example, I've been at CEDU. Staff have noticed that I'm gaining a little bit of weight, and they suggest to me not to have something extra with my dinner. Is it then psychological that you know you're going to be attacked for that in RAPS, so you stop yourself from carrying out those actions? Like, do you preempt the fact that you're going to be attacked?
Absolutely. Anything to avoid it. You don't take it, you're gonna hear about
it. Okay. And the magazines, TV, internet?
We were pretty much football on Sundays. And then Sunday nights, they had a movie night with a pre-selected movie, always something rated G, PG at the most, but it had to be inspirational, very much like the music. Sterile, very emotional, very inspirational movies. Nothing with gratuitous violence, nothing with any sex, nothing with anything really interesting, so to speak. But if you were on consequences of any type or out of agreement, you missed out on it. You were indicious for the whole time. Or you were all day on work assignments on Sunday instead of watching TV. As far as news, I remember they pulled out the TV once. Not even when Kurt Cobain died did we watch the news. But when the Northridge earthquake happened, they pulled out the TV, called off everything, including RAPS for that day, and we all watched TV because a lot of the kids were from Southern California. Other than that, complete information control. No newspapers, no magazines, no television, there was no internet really at the time. 93, 94, it was all online chatting, and they didn't have computers.
I read that there was a very small selection of pre-approved books that you could read.
Yes, and of course, pre-approved. Everybody had a copy of The Prophet. You could read that at any time. Otherwise, the library was very small, and it was, again, very much like the movies or the music. It was all along the theme of what they were trying to impart. Anything that deviated from that or gave you any ideas outside of the CEDU program, they weren't.
you were encouraged to keep an eye on each other, and obviously in RAPs you could be pulled up by another resident for something that you did or didn't do at any point. So it was encouraged for you to snitch on each other as residents.
There were two major methods that they did this. That was through use of what were called dirt lists and RAP requests.
Mm-hmm.
Dirt lists were things that you needed to keep. Anytime you broke an agreement, you needed to write it down and put it out there in the next RAP. If you didn't, God forbid somebody saw it, because they would have to write it down and then fill out what's called a RAP request to confront you on it in an attack therapy RAP session. Otherwise, they were in more severe trouble than you were in. Two people saw you break an agreement, God help you. Because now you had RAP requests up the wazoo, and 2, 3, 4, 5, however many people witnessed you break this agreement had to all put in that RAP request, and they would all attack you in the RAP session.
It's a really difficult one now, because if they don't do it, then themselves, they are going to be the subject of the attack.
So if 5 people saw you do something out of agreement and only 4 of them filled out a RAP request, those 4 people would attack you on it in the RAP, but then the staff would ask, was there anybody else there that saw this? That was a question every time. Did anybody else see this? Was anybody else involved? And those 4 people would have to say, if one of them said, X person was with us and the other 3 didn't, those 3 would get toasted. And if all 4 of them, as most likely would happen, said, yeah, this person was with us, then that person would be brought into the next RAP. And it would be an even worse scene for them than it was for you breaking the agreement in the first place.
How did that affect the dynamic between residents?
Never trust anyone.
So you're constantly living not only with the anxiety of the staff and what they're going to do next, especially you with the particular staff member that you had in charge of you. You've also got other residents.
This information, even if you were able to create a friendship or a relationship with another student deep enough that you could break a rule with that person, and neither of you come out with it on a dirt list or RAP request, down the road, 2-3 weeks later, that student might be getting attacked on an entirely other matter in a RAP session. And in order to save their skin, they might just come out and say, well, at some point the staff would say, what other dirt do you have?
Right.
You know, they'd be in your face. You got to have all sorts of dirt right now. What else have you got? And they would come out in a panic. They would say, well, Michael and I pop off together.
No.
Next thing you know, there goes that little agreement. And that kind of a relationship and agreement in the first place was against the rules and out of agreement.
So you
just having that type of relationship where you could pop off with forbidden signs with someone was a punishable offense in itself.
That reminds me of another documentary I've watched where you, in the prison system in America, for example, where people are so, inmates are so sort of preoccupied by where the white supremacists go, where the people of color go. You know, there's all different sections in the actual prison for people from different ethnic backgrounds, and they keep these people so focused on arguing amongst each other and staying within their own territories that they don't question those in charge. So it's almost like the staff are pinning you against each other so much that you're more worried about each other than actually taking a step back and saying, hang on a minute, like, we know something's wrong here, but we're not talking about it because we're too worried about each other.
Absolutely. And the worst part of that is that you don't really see it coming from the staff. Because you'll go into a RAP and you'll be so worried about a couple of things that have gone on between you and other students. You won't see it when that staff knows something from your history from way before CEDU that they had a discussion with your parents about at some point and throw it in your face. And all of a sudden, you got to run your stuff on that, all the while never seeing it coming in the first place. You're so worried about this student
Everything else. Yeah.
and what they've got on you and what you've got on them. Bottom line, never trust anybody. Any type of relationship that you make that goes beyond what they allow is subject to exposure. And when it's exposed, that power struggle of consequence, that ever increasing level of consequences will be on you.
And after these rap sessions where people have, you've written your dirt lists, they've put their requests in, you've had this attack therapy, you're supposed to all lay down together and have a smushing session together, which is essentially just everybody getting into one giant human huddle and cuddling up with each other, staff included.
Absolutely. Staff were usually at the center of each individual smush pile, and the piles were so large that they would merge into one another. There are plenty of pictures available online and different places about it, how it worked and examples of it. Smushing was a tool that they used for many, many reasons. One of which, it evolved from early CEDU when sex was allowed between students. They were There were some adolescents, but in the early 60s and early 70s, or late 60s, early 70s, the first years of CEDU, there were a bunch of adults that were in it, much like Synod, before it really went strictly adolescents and children. And there was a lot of sex going on. There was, all through the 70s, it was a hotbed of orgies, just like Synod.
Okay.
When they went full adolescence and for profit, they had to take sex out of it entirely. But the relic that was smushing, that facilitated these orgies and this sex that was rampant in early CEDU, kept on because it was useful. You were expected to tell your life story to a different student or staff member twice a week. And that was the time that they reserved for you to do that. So over the course of your stay at that school, you pretty much were expected to smush with everyone and tell everyone your entire life story and hear theirs back, while intimate with someone that had just screamed their brains out at you not an hour earlier about what a piece of shit you are.
It's not only that, but the fact that you're not even allowed to make eye contact or hold hands with or converse too long with somebody that in a different environment you can cuddle with and lay with and be, intimate with without having actual sexual contact. Right. And for teenagers with hormones running rampant and then being told that actually, sex isn't allowed, you can listen to staff talk about all the sex that they've had in their disclosures. How do you process this as a teenager?
With a whole lot of angst and confusion.
Mm-hmm.
It made you question your sexuality for some kids. Mm-hmm. Because not only were you made to smush with people of the opposite sex, but the same sex as well. More often with people of the same sex, because if you smushed with someone of the opposite sex too many times, you now had a sexual contract, and that was a whole new ball of wax. So,
and then you're on bands from each other.
Oh yeah, and worse, and one of you or both of you are getting put on full time, and there's, it gets bad. So you have to rotate people, number one. So even people you don't know, don't like, you have to smush with them.
Okay.
Staff as well, like you said, right in the middle of it. If you're trying to be a man apart and kind of, all right, I'm just going to rest my shoulder up against yours, the staff member at the center of the smush pile is going to grab you and put your head right on that person's lap and say, start smushing, stop being so standoffish.
And how often do the smushes happen? Are they after every rap session?
Every day.
you arrive at CEDU. You talked at the beginning of our interview about being absolutely turned upside down from being dropped off and almost abandoned at CEDU. Having your packages there.
That's the lucky ones of us. Those who were kidnapped and escorted by Bill Lane and Associates, it was even more disconcerting because you woke up the morning prior to two guys on either side of your bed with zip ties telling you can come the hard way or the easy way. And your parents standing in my doorway with shaking and crying because they're whatever they're feeling. But literally, these people grab you and then transport you halfway across the country. Sometimes, literally in zip ties, you can go up to therapeutic transportation has become so big thanks to Bill Lane and Associates. The TSA knows what it is. So kids will have these two giant ex-military guys standing on either side of them with zip ties over their heads, being paraded through the airport. And they should go to TSA and say, I don't know, these guys are kidnapping me. Look, they're holding me hostage. Wow. These guys will pull out a piece of paper. TSA will be like, we see this. Therapeutic transport, on with you guys.
You're taken, you're at CEDU, you have your first day, you have your wrap, and then at the end of it, you're just pushed into some random person's lap and expected on that first day that you arrived there to just tell this person your life story. How confusing is that?
Not just that, but I'm willing to wager this is the story for the majority of people in my situation. But you were put into your first wrap with your new family.
Okay.
The school was broken into families that were led by different people. They were the senior staff there. There were usually 4 of them at CEDU, 4 families, if I remember correctly, about 25 kids each through all different phases of the program. But that family head would have you in your first wrap. And then after that first wrap, while you were looking at this huge room of smushing people, completely wrecked from being destroyed, your first wrap ever, that same family head would be the one to drag you into your first smush pile.
Right.
So it would be those very same people who just attacked you on your first day in your first attack therapy session that you were forced to smush with on your first smush. So the maximum amount of disequilibrium they could inspire within you on your first day was what they did.
Okay. And for new people, new residents arriving to CEDU, was there ever like any hazing that took place? Would other students, would they go out of their way to make life more difficult, or was it kind of more of a unspoken sort of, you really don't know what's going to happen whilst you're here?
And just like anywhere else, there was a lot of dynamic between the kids. Some liked each other, some did not. Some personalities meshed, some personalities clashed. There was you couldn't build friendships the way you wanted to without fear of being confronted for something. So
the last point that I had personally, I know that obviously we've spoken about how sex wasn't allowed, but it appears that it actually did happen on some occasions, because there's been some speculation that actually some residents would receive abortions whilst attending CEDU. Is that something that you've heard about personally?
Personally, no, but I can say to point in that direction, there was sex going on.
Okay.
It happened. Anybody who was there in the late 90s and early 2000s will tell you that. It became more frequent as the Brown schools got involved.
Okay.
That kind of became more of a thing, but nobody had kids there. That's for sure. And there sure as hell was no birth control. So if a student became pregnant, no other students heard about it or knew about it. So either these 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-old kids are better at pardon my term, the pull-out method than grown adults, or something else is going on there.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't too sure about that one, but I just wanted to bring that up.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I couldn't say. Never really had a sexual encounter while I was there.
Okay.
Let alone had to deal with the repercussions of it. And as a male, I wouldn't have been involved with that. I wouldn't have even known if the female student I was with had gotten pregnant.
Okay.
So that would be something that the female students alone could really give testimony.
Right. Well, the more people talk, who knows, what else will come out from these types of conversations. I don't know if you had anything to add.
No, you are
I wanted to make sure that
a thorough podcaster. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and to your audience on this matter. And I really do hope that it inspires a whole lot of curiosity and future revelation about the matter. That's what's needed to stop it from its continued existence, and to, the adage is true. Those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And more kids are suffering every day because of this, at literally the hands of Synanon and Synanon-derived programs all over the country and world.
Absolutely. I mean, you're completely right. And I'm so appreciative for your, candid experience, and your sharing your knowledge with everybody, and just letting the listeners of this small podcast understand a little bit more about the goings on at CEDU. And hopefully there will be more dialogue that starts from this. You've got your screenplay that you're working on, which I've personally read, and it's fantastic. And it's true. There's other memoirs I've read that are very enlightening. I just hope that, as you've said, hopefully we can just keep going and talking more about it and getting more information out there, especially just to, if anything, stop it from happening still today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for touching on the subject.
No, thank you, Michael. Thank you. It's been so lovely to sit down and speak to you after talking for so many weeks. It's been great to finally be able to sit down and just, and have this electronic face-to-face meeting finally. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Casey.